Well, as it's now just past 9 o'clock and there will be more people joining us, thank you for being with us this morning. Let's kick off. And a formal good morning to you. My name is Ian Marcus. I am the president of the Cambridge University Land Society, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here to this webinar hosted by Culls and in cooperation with Savills. The topic for today, as you're all aware, is what role does investing in innovation play in getting to net zero in the built environment? And I'm delighted to welcome Tanguy Quero from JLL, Rahul Parekh from 2150 Venture Capital, and Costa Matsoukas from PropTech One as our speakers today. And as always, this event will be moderated by the chair of the Land Society's ESG Forum, Amro Kotecha, who I will pass on to in a moment. I wanted to thank our speakers and the team at Savills and AMI for their continuing support and engagement as we commence this second series of ESG webinars that was so successful during the last year or two. AMI will advise you later of several forthcoming events which are already in the calendar. I must say, in my 40 years in business, I've never seen a topic, discussion or movement, namely climate change and sustainability, with all its implications, move to the top of everyone's agenda so quickly, appropriately now leading most organisations' thought leadership. It is also fascinating to me that throughout my entire career, I've always looked over the Atlantic to get an insight into trends as to emerging sectors, strategies and financing techniques, which will, in a period of time, normally between 1 and 10 years, cross over to Europe. On this subject, uniquely and unequivocally, Europe is leading the US in terms of debate, discussion and implementation. Speaking to the head of the Land Economy Department just yesterday at Cambridge, he confirmed they are about to endow a new chair for a professor of climate law, the first in this country, to the department, to complement the masters already offered on environmental policy. So I'm pleased to say that this subject has for many years been at the heart of the Land Economy Department's teaching and the university more broadly by the Cambridge Centre for Climate Science. We have so far approaching 100 people online and expecting more to join. So thank you, and I see how relevant this subject is for all of us. So we look forward to a very lively discussion. And with that, Ami, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that kind introduction, and thank you for introducing all the panelists. May I ask all the panelists to join as well? Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our ESG webinar titled The Role of Innovation in Getting to Net Zero. My name is Amro Partners, and I'm chair of the ESG Sustainability Forum at Culls. I'm very pleased to introduce again Tanguy Quero of JLL Spark, Kostas Matsoukas of PropTech One Ventures, and Rahul Parekh of 2150, who are all innovators and investors in technology to solve the pain points in the real estate sector, including the biggest one that we're going to speak about today, which is climate change. Now, almost a year ago, actually, it was, I think, the 12th of December 2020, that the UK government announced that it was going to commit to its nationally determined contributions at the level of reduction or reducing emissions by 68% by 2030. That then was turned into legislation earlier this year in April, where Boris Johnson announced made a further announcement of a reduction of 78% of carbon emissions on an economy-wide basis by 2035, and a promise for all of us to get to net zero by 2050. The real estate sector, as we all know, is a major emitter and a major source of carbon emissions, and hence if we were to take this responsibility seriously, we would need to do everything that we could do to reduce the 120 metric tons or so of carbon that we emit every year. Now, the biggest problem that we have today, as I see it, is that we potentially need to collaborate more as an industry and also to include innovation into our conversation. The committee, the Climate Change Committee, in its 6th annual report, laid out some methodologies or some ways that we could all engage in carbon reduction strategies and decarbonization pathways. Some of them are as simple as behavioral change, which are simple to talk about, but not easy to implement, as we'll talk about in a minute. And the other is, of course, fuel switching technologies, decarbonization of our grid, and decarbonization of our heating systems. So first of all, I'd like to ask the panel to come on board and to set up the discussion by saying or contributing as to what you think are the areas or the levers that we currently have that we can apply straight away to dealing with carbon reductions in our sector. May I ask Rahul to respond first?
Hi, thank you, Ami, and nice to be here. So in terms of levers, I think if you look at the IEA report on sectors that can drive gigaton level reductions, that showed that the most commercially ready industries with the highest level impact are actually centered around the built world. So all of us here that are involved within kind of the urban environment and technology can have actually big impact now. And how we build it, how we cool it, those are the main levers that we're focused on. Like, for example, just switching to LED lighting globally would save 1.4 gigatons. And then there's mobility. If all cars went electric overnight, we'd see 3 gigaton impact in CO2 emissions per year, after taking into account the 20% global increase in electricity demand. And new building components, if those are used at scale, they would be big drivers to reduce the huge CO2 impact of concrete and steel. Concrete and cement accounts for 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. Steel between 6 and 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. So these, I think, are the kind of biggest levers we have, within the built world to find these kind of alternative building materials, improve ways of heating and cooling our buildings, and improve urban mobility.
That's great. Before we, and I think all the points you make are very valid and tackle the embodied carbon element of our emissions pretty well. Before we move on to that, isn't our biggest problem our standing stock of buildings? There are statistics out there that say 80% of the stock that we need to address is already here and is standing, and will need to be addressed potentially to get to net zero. And obviously we want to address it without using carbon offsets. We come to that discussion as well, whether we absolutely need to use carbon offsets and on. So Tongi, may I turn to you and ask you, what is your view of how we can tackle in-use emissions within our standing stock? And where do you think the levers are that we have currently can be used better?
Yeah, I think you touch on the biggest problem, and as Rahul just mentioned, it's a combination of several levers that we will need to use in the next two renovation cycle, I would say, before 2030. So combination of low carbon material, modular renovation, or circular economy are what we will need to be put into play now in the next cycle to be able to tackle this. But I would say, you mentioned in your introduction, what the biggest lever would be collaboration. Because if we want to achieve all this, we will need all the stakeholders in the value chain to be collaborating to accelerate implementation of new technology, to be able to achieve this renovation, to be able to improve the performance of the buildings. And we've been all focusing on pushing adoption of new technology in the built environment. And it's already been proven to be a challenge, focusing on the ROI of the solution. But with this typical subject of sustainability, where we have, I would say, no choice but to move on, we need everybody to accelerate and to collaborate. So I would say that the three I mentioned, plus really adoption of technology, are essential. And the first one being the data. We need everybody to be on the journey of assessing, setting targets, putting action plan into place. So that's about it. this is a challenge.
That's great. Thank you. And Costa, just building on what Tanguy and Rahul have said, from your perspective, how is the UK performing relative to the other regions that you work in? So Benelux and France is where you were really involved in, obviously the DACH regions in Germany. It'd be quite interesting for our audience to get a perspective on where we are in terms of data management, monitoring, etc. So really managing that sort of in-use emissions pathway, if you like.
Yeah, so I can tell you in terms of deal flow that we see that coming back to this EU regulation in terms of taxonomies, Green New Deal, etc., founders in all countries of Europe taking up this, let's say, heat in order to create something in that direction. We see in all countries of Europe companies that focus on modular construction, on prefab, on trying to build something in order to basically enhance the traditional players that currently or in the future will face problems of scarce resources and of course of increased costs due to, for example, new regulation that will inhibit you to work as you have worked in the past. So something will and need to change. And one example I would like to give you is that in terms of building stocks, we focused last year on a company in our portfolio called EcoWorks that does exactly that. So they focus on the biggest level that we see is renovating the building stock, the existing building stock, by using new ways of doing it. Because the current ways, the traditional way of renovating a facade just takes way too long. In order to do it with traditional means, you would take 100 years instead of 10 or 20 years. So what EcoWorks does is they basically do the renovating by using prefab modules. And what is really cool about them is when they started, and I just want to explain like where this is all heading. When they started, of course, if they're not at scale, the product is very expensive. So what they did is they were at the beginning, they had always close connection to the German government. The German government increased the subsidies for their kind of standard, like the construction standard they built, from 25 to 40%. And this is like all before Green New Deal, all before ESG taxonomies, and all before the Green Party actually being part of the coalition, which is happening right now. So what I want to say is there is a lot of heat even being on before all this climate crisis being on the radar of everybody. And I think this will also be part of the next 20 years.
Interesting. It's interesting to know that you have got innovation going on in Germany to deal with retrofits at scale, because that is one of the biggest problems here in the UK that we need to resolve. And it's that fabric efficiency, the carbon intensity in the fabric of the building that needs to be addressed, and it's not an easy one. Rahul, if I may come back to you, if you could, for the benefit of the audience, I mean, let's just dive deep into decarbonization pathways. So we're talking about whether innovation is necessary here in order to decarbonize. So leaving aside new stock that's coming on, which is obviously going to benefit from a really well decarbonized electricity grid, and it's going to benefit from many kind of urban innovation projects that will hopefully mean that we have green fuels coming in to heat our buildings as well. But let's look at decarbonization pathways that are or can be applicable to retrofits. What technologies out there do you think? I mean, building on what Costa said about dealing with the facade, what is out there that we can actually employ straight away that perhaps we're not using as much as we should right now?
So going to the first part of your question was, kind of to what extent is innovation necessary? And then, what technologies are out there. So I think to answer the first part, I think if you look at the curve of emissions from now to 2050, if we want to get to net zero, we need to bend the curve incredibly fast, because up until now, our emissions per year have just been steadily increasing. So if we want to have an impact and get to zero, we need a really steep reduction in that curve in just the next 9 or 10 years. And 9 or 10 years is nothing, right? It's the kind of typical length of a typical VC fund cycle, or even less than that, which means we need to start deploying these technologies at scale that start having an impact today. So when we think about kind of other technologies that are being funded, like, funding direct air capture machines that can be deployed in 10 years time, or working on kind of plastic eating bacteria in a lab that might work in 10 years time, that won't make an impact right now. But we can use relatively more mature technologies within the built environment that are having a big impact. So just kind of, you mentioned that distinction between kind of new build and retrofit. We are spending 15% of global GDP on construction, but it's the most laggard sector in terms of adopting technology on both fronts, right? Both in terms of new builds and retrofits. So the biggest problem in the urban environment is our global addiction to cement and concrete. And the only way to resolve that is through innovation. So for example, we invested in Carbon Cure, which is a company that's developed a way to capture carbon within the concrete manufacturing process. And that applies to both, existing building stock that's being renovated, demolished and rebuilt, as well as new building stock. We're thinking a lot about wooden building materials that have less embodied carbon, but can be as strong as concrete. So we need more of this stuff. And then when we're thinking about kind of, retrofitting existing buildings, the most important thing is energy efficiency in building stock, right? So, we know that existing building stock accounts for 2/3 of energy usage. That's both in terms of kind of actually constructing it, and half of that from actually operating it. And most of the impact in operating it is from the fact that these old buildings leak. They have slight holes in walls, or they have HVAC systems that are not operating efficiently. And so by kind of going in and improving the efficiency of those buildings, then actually you can significantly reduce energy usage. So another company we just invested in is a company called AeroSeal, which is doing kind of duct sealing for buildings. And it's the kind of like unsexy technologies in the built environment. Like we call it kind of making the unsexy sexy, because really these like unsexy technologies, like, kind of improving ceiling ducts, they're actually having huge impact. So like, a company like AeroSeal that can go and actually, with really simple technology, seal a whole building, improve the efficiency of the HVAC system. It's amazing how much impact they can have to reduce the energy usage of a building. So these are the things that kind of we think we should be looking at as VCs today.
That's great. And Tongi, from your experience at JLL Spark, what is the adoption rate of technology then? So if we all agree that we need to be more innovative in how we tackle climate change, and how we address our decarbonization pathways to get to the most sort of optimal outcomes, if you like, there will be some element of risk involved right at the start of the process, when you're sitting there trying to say, well, you've committed to net zero as a company or as a real estate sector player, and now it's about the tangible action to make it happen. You have a series of scenario analyses, perhaps, that you need to go through in order to decide which pathway you take to decarbonization. And of course, it's an iterative process as it goes along. But if you were to, in that process, try to embed and adopt innovation, there's an element of risk just around that, both in technology failure and just obsolescence rate, etc. What, from your perspective at JLL, do you see the rate of adoption being, and how often are you asked about an innovative or creative way to decarbonizing?
Yeah, so I think that to answer your question, first there's a first problem, that is the ability of companies to work with early stage startup as a whole. It's already something that we need to be working on, and regardless of the subject, whether it's sustainability or other type of technology, it's always the first thing. We need to make sure that our clients and the built world in itself is improving its capability to work with emerging technology. This is what we do at JLL Spark. We try to facilitate, we try to make this connection faster. Because to answer really your question, the rhythm is still very slow. It's improving, but I don't think on the sustainability front, it's not near what it needs to be if we want to achieve what Raoul said. We need to have an impact in the next 10 years. So to do that, there are a couple of things. First, we hope to be able to help our clients by vetting some technology and having people assessing technology that say, hey, this is a robust solution. This is a solution that is well-funded. This is a solution that you can trust to be there in 6 months or in 12 years. And we make assessments that the return on investment, the use cases that we are talking about are essential. So there is this education part that is important. And then the second thing is this return on investment analysis and the risks that everybody is assessing. And for that, I think in the past years, people were really looking at return on investment on the financial perspective. Mm-hmm. Some were looking at the return on investment on a green premium perspective, but they were the most innovative one. I think with the change in the cost of doing nothing, the change in the IFRS that was mentioned during COP26, all this will change the metrics to assess the return on investment on these new technologies. And so this will be the way to accelerate technology adoption, because this is the way to align everybody from fund management to asset management to property management. If you change the way you calculate the return on investment, you change the way you look at the risk, and you will be able to accelerate.
That's a really good perspective. And from that perspective, then, where are the hurdles? I mean, what I can see immediately from what you're saying is that not being able to apply universal kind of pricing to decarbonization is an issue, right? So we can go into a whole discussion about carbon pricing and carbon taxes, etc. But essentially having a baseline to work with, and like you suggested, knowing and fully understanding the cost of not adopting technology is really important. So how do we tackle that? As part of this, there are two aspects of innovation, right? You need the scalability, so you need the adoption, but you also need a proper understanding of the cost of adoption, if you like. And within that, like you said, there's an embedded cost of not adopting. So anyone in the panel really who wants to answer this, what are your views on how we can actually make this happen in the real estate sector so that there is better and quicker adoption? And and hopefully not a massive concern about failure, because at the end of the day, it is an iterative process.
I can jump in with a quick thought from my side. Mm-hmm. I think industry adoption is the biggest challenge we have today. If you look at the latest McKinsey report on technology sectors, construction is the most laggard sector, right, in terms of technology. And so I think, until these technologies are cheaper and more efficient, they won't get used, right? So for example, take Carbon Cure, the investment I mentioned earlier. The reason their technology to capture carbon in concrete is working is because it makes concrete stronger, so you can use less of it. And it also generates carbon offsets, which can be sold at $100, $150 a ton. If you just go to a concrete plant and say, please use this technology to reduce your CO2 emissions, and it will cost you more money, they'll never do it. So you need to create incentives for that. For example, any material that replaces concrete, it needs to be stronger and cheaper, otherwise it won't get used. We see this problem with CLT, right? Everyone's always talking about the premise of CLT. And the biggest issue is that the acoustics are terrible. So why would you build a block of flats with CLT if you don't have sound insulation? CLT is 5 times lighter than concrete, and mass is the main absorbent of sound waves. So if you have terrible sound insulation, CLT might not be the answer. But there are alternative building materials, for example, we've been looking at that do solve that problem. And if you can make them cheaper and stronger than concrete, then that's a huge, huge impact that you can have. And that's where kind of venture capital comes in to try to fund these technologies early, take risky bets. There's someone mentioned on the chat just now what CLT, that it's cross-laminated timber. So it's a wooden building material alternative to concrete, which had a lot of premise because it was typically just as strong as concrete in some cases, but has some other drawbacks.
Great. And if we could build on that, so you talked about you talked about incentives and structures which actually allow for scalability. So, I mean, when we look at renewable energy, nobody thought it would come in so much in terms of price and become so affordable. Solar panels, PVs, everything's coming in terms of price and become more affordable with lower payback periods. And when you, like Tongi, you suggested, when you take in the environmental payback, it becomes almost a no-brainer. Yet, I mean, these are very mature technologies today. Somebody on the chat has mentioned technology related to methane capture, which is again an age-old technology. Is it just the finance then, or is it just the financial incentive, or do we actually need a much more sort of universally acceptable regulatory structure? I mean, does this all have to be embedded and kind of prescribed at building regs level to actually make it happen, do you think? Costa, please come in with your views. Yeah.
Yes. So I think Rahul just made a very good point there. It's not like it's a chicken egg problem. Of course, we have a lot of solutions out there, and we as VCs, we see them and see the potential of the future of adopting these solutions. But I think in order to help the traditional players to actually adopt something that is a little bit more expensive, something that is not in their normal value chain, you need a little bit of a push. And I think we have pushes, multiple pushes here. We have EU taxonomy that will be fixed by 2022. So people need to apply by that. We will have the green taxonomy that is subsidizing a lot of things in order to make the transition, for example, to use, I don't know, more expensive ways of renovating. Or for example, the German law, like the new German contract of the new coalition, just actually mentions the standard of EcoWorks in their coalition contracts, that they want to push this. They didn't mention EcoWorks by the name, but the description of the way that they want to foster in the future renovations in Germany is basically the homepage of EcoWorks. So what I want to say is, if you look closely what is happening all around the world right now, there are a lot of pushes from the politicians in terms of regulations, not as rules. You don't have rules, but you have like subsidies that will lead the right players into the right direction. So I think there is a lot of happening right now. Just one more sentence. So when we incepted PropTech One, our pitch to the founders was usually like, we are here to build the bridge to the traditional players. We see today the traditional players come to us to ask for intros to certain solutions because they want to engage, because they have to engage.
Great. Thank you. Moving on to the point about collaboration, we all agree that collaboration is really important. But collaboration at what level? When it comes to innovation and scalability, you often need collaboration that's much wider than your estate or your asset or your building or whatever your individual ownership is. You need, for district heating systems, for example, you need a wider collaboration at a local authority level. That's one example. And there are many other examples where you might be wanting to improve a whole community's ability to become more climate conscious, for example. Solar panel projects that at a community level are taking some interest in some parts of the world. Tell me, from your perspective, do you see any of that happening as VCs? Are you playing the role of joining the dots at a wider level? And Rahul, perhaps with the involvement of 2150 in urban conurbation and smart city projects, maybe you have some sort of insight to share there.
Yeah, well, I think the point on collaboration is the most important one, because not one fund, not one government can solve this problem. It's a global problem, and it needs collaboration across across industry sectors, governments, investment firms. From a venture capital perspective, we see, and the reason why we all collaborate as VC funds is to share risk, because these risks are quite big right now. We invest in these technologies at very early stages to give them the capital they need to make those technologies scalable and usable to be deployed. And if we fail, to find the right ones, then we all pay for it. It's our tax dollars or pension savings that are going into the investment vehicles that are investing in venture capital funds. So we try to be kind of collaborative, locally and globally. And then, from our perspective, where we think at 2150 we can have an impact or an edge, if you like, is that our LPs have 50 million meters squared of real estate under management. And so some of the early stage technologies that we invest in, we can help them scale, across our LP base by introducing those kind of great technologies to our investors that are, either kind of, sovereign funds or private equity real estate funds that need those technologies and haven't seen them because they're so early stage. So that's where we can kind of, have an impact of getting these technologies to scale. And once they get to scale, then industry adoption becomes much easier because they become cheaper and become more efficient. And so, that's where I believe we can have a big impact.
And do you see, this is to any of the panelists, do you see public-private partnerships from that perspective coming forward to actually scale some of these innovations? Because like we said, it is all about collaboration, and one or two or three sources of capital may not be sufficient in order to get some of these technologies to where they need to be to actually make a difference. Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think what Costa said earlier, I think it's a combination of regulation plus investment support into via different scheme, and we've seen many of this in various countries in Europe. So yeah, I think the public is governments are more and more investing and playing their part in the financing of all this. But I think, yeah, it's collaboration. To back to your point, it's a collaboration with all the stakeholders in the industry and with the public institution as well, because everybody needs a clear framework to work in. If you want to invest, if you want to scale technology, you need to be able to have visibility on what you need to achieve, what will be the regulation, what will be your support to do that, what would be your incentive to do that. So yeah, we will need to collaborate deeply with all the public institutions to be able to make this readable and so actionable.
Absolutely. And on that basis, then, would it be the panel's view that if we don't have enough collaboration, which can happen, and we all get very focused on our own portfolios and our own individual frameworks or decarbonization pathways, then we may end up with suboptimal solutions? Is that something you would agree with? There's somebody on the chat, Oliver Harwood, who says we should apply a carbon tax and leave it for the markets to decide as to what technology survives and who adopts which technology and how they get on with it, as long as we get the end result. But is it all about that, or should we be thinking much more about our influence on the environment and the built environment in a holistic sense when we are applying our own decarbonization pathways?
I think, to be honest, or in my view, if we had a lot of time, like if we had let's say another 20 years in order to build or let the market build by its own market leader solutions for every segment, then yeah, let's decide the market, give it a price, and then the strongest and the best solution will be there and foster its way into basically every channel. But I think as we're right now time concerned and we need to move fast, I think it's very important that everybody is trying to move into the same direction. And this is why
I mean, one example I always give of the potential of a suboptimal solution being driven by regulatory pressure is this whole idea of EPC ratings and using EPC ratings as the methodology to decide on about how carbon efficient a building is. And we all know that it has a big limitation because it doesn't measure in-use emissions in the way it is applied in the UK, at least. I know that some other countries in Europe have a much more advanced EPC rating system, which may capture in-use emissions as well. But given this big limitation and the way the government has actually put the EPC rating up as a standard for us to follow, and A and B rated buildings are become eligible for some sort of sustainable finance or green finance, whereas those are under C and below. I mean, it's a good starting point, I would say, but these are the sorts of principles that can get us really stuck in mediocrity, and that I'd worry about. So in some ways, I think what's being suggested in terms of leaving it to the market may mean that we end up with more efficient solutions, but also we will have to take the risk of whether we can get there or not, and the risk of innovation becoming obsolescent in that time frame. So that's very interesting. Coming back to possibly the first point that I made, which was one that the Climate Change Committee talks about a lot, which is behavioral change. And we've all touched upon it in some way or the other. Insofar as decarbonization pathways are concerned, a big real estate landlord may claim that most of the behavioral change is out of their ambit and falls under scope 3 and is possibly the hardest for them to tackle because it's the tenant's behavior that we're talking about there, starting from switching off lights, but when you leave the room, but many other things after that. What is the panel's view on how innovation can, I mean, it's not even, I suppose it's not even innovation, but how technology that we already have today, and we talked about the smart meters, etc. How can we apply that in a cost-efficient manner to get that in quickly? Because that must be an easy win, right? Anyone want to take that?
You've got many IoT solutions today, and that are really like we have in our portfolio a company called Infogrid that really help deploy IoT solution at scale very rapidly. That can really help you with not heating a room when the window is open, or not even just overheating, or having lights switching, limitation of water for smart cleaning. So many very impactful use cases that can be deployed very rapidly. I think to have an impact on the tenant and the tenant community, you also need to show the results. And I think all the tenant experience app, like again in our portfolio, HQO, can play a very important role here in two ways. First, being giving the capability to tell people what is happening, what has been done, and how they can engage to help everybody to contribute. So there are things today that I would categorize into indirect technology that have an ESG impact, that can really help the community and the tenants to improve their to reduce their footprint, let's say.
Great. And does anybody else on the panel want to comment on any sort of innovation that they've come across that can really track behavioral change? And we're not talking, so we're talking about, like Tanguy said, metrics that actually help us manage and bring down utilization in buildings. But even more broadly than that, I mean, waste management is a massive area. Food waste and waste management is a massive area where we need serious behavioral change. So is the use of single-use plastics. What you see out there in terms of adoption within the built environment to treat all of that as part of our responsibility and to start talking, not just talking, but taking action to reduce those in those areas.
I guess so. What we see a lot lately is a lot of circular economy projects. So companies that actually try to either reduce waste or from the beginning try to implement solutions, building buildings in a way that they can be given away to the circular economy again in the end of the lifetime. So we see like marketplaces popping up that try to bring demolished parts of buildings into the economy again. And I think there are a lot of ways how we will close this loop. And but besides that, I think there are also like a lot of behavioral things coming to the B2C world, like not only like the construction part, but actually the consumers, like the people who are in the buildings, like tenant-facing apps that actually give you the information that all those IoT devices collect in the building, like letting you know the lights are on or helping you to know like when you enter the building as, for example, like a whole office team, the building adapts to how the behavioral changes. And I think there's like a intermix between like B2B products going into B2C behavior and adapting to the needs we currently face.
Okay, so you talk about B2C behavior, and we speak about circular economy. So we've just had the Environmental Act become law, and there is the twin challenge there of biodiversity and climate change being brought to the fore, and a very clear legislative environment being developed to stop our waterways getting polluted with effluents, and also to bring in and reduce air quality, air pollutants that ruin our air quality. Now, what do you think we should be doing in the built environment to actually make some of these things mandatory? So if this is, we already have this Environmental Act on us, it's legislative pressure on us. What can we make mandatory? What can we just put into our leases, for example, and say, you can't do this sort of stuff. You have to segregate your waste. Do you think that's a potential addition we can make in terms of behavioral change on the B2C side, using technology and framing it in a way that's actually acceptable and polite and nice, but not allowing people to get away with it? I mean, where does the buck stop?
I think if you want individual people to do it, there has to be incentives to do so. And there will always be people that are kind of, driven towards helping the environment, which is great, but that's not the majority, unfortunately, certainly not in this country yet. So I think that, the government can help, right? I mean, they stated an aim to install 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028. But only have a plan, for providing 90,000 homes with them in the next 3 years. Gas boilers are not set to be banned until 2033. It seems a little bit too slow, given the speed and the certainty, we need to meet the net zero objectives. And there's always going to be that kind of incentive problem and misalignment between the kind of tenant and landlord. And so, to solve that, we either need to create some incentives somehow, or the government needs to step in to help.
Great, interesting. And
I'll be maybe a little bit more optimistic here. Our survey shows that I think I don't have the exact figure top of my head, but more and more what you do for environment is a question asking recruitment interviews. And so I think companies will face a pressure from from their staff and the people they want to recruit to be able to demonstrate that they are actually doing things. And maybe more than regulation, or maybe a little bit faster than regulation, I think war for talent is something that will be a strong lever for corporates to behave on that front. Maybe a little bit naive, maybe a little bit more optimistic, but I think it's really a trend. And yeah, there is no only one solution in all these problems. So I think this could be also a strong contribution, create a strong contribution to change the behaviors.
Great. That's interesting. And I think now we must sort of give the audience a kind of a proper flavor of what technologies are out there and how applicable they are. So let's talk about decarbonizing heating, for example, and green hydrogen and all the other technologies that are being proposed out there. If anyone on the panel wants to have a go at this and just lay out some of the obvious categories and some of the winners within those categories, the front runners, if you like, at the moment, that will become sort of inevitable in terms of adoption over time. And where do you think, if you think there are any risks with some of the others? It'd be interesting to know from your perspective as to what you see or who you see the front runners as being.
I'd say the main perspective here to take into account is time, because some of the technologies that can have the biggest impact, for example, alternative building materials, alternative forms of electric urban mobility, alternative proteins, space technology, satellites, fusion technology as an alternative energy to decarbonize the grid. All of those right now have one, huge capital requirements to develop the technology, and two, long timelines to get to commerciality. And so I think that, the biggest levers for the long term are there and are being developed, and we see it already that venture capital is there to fund these technologies early, and more large funds are being set up now with lots of capital to do that. So now we need to focus on the kind of short-term levers that we talked about. You mentioned infogrid, right? Those kind of technologies that are doing IoT solutions to improve energy efficiency in buildings. There's lots of them, and they're having a big impact now. Improving the HVAC systems in buildings. So I think that we're doing this already, right? Like venture capital is there, and we see it in the market. We're investing in these early stage technologies that can have big impact now. I think there's two things. One, we need more of them. So we need more entrepreneurs, great passionate entrepreneurs that care about the environment, the sustainability in the urban environment to be coming out and starting businesses in these areas. And two, we need support across other sectors, particularly government support, so that governments need to act quicker. So that governments are kind of, what we see at least, like very good at kind of longer term mandates. They need now short-term action to help support.
Okay, I'm going to take a few questions now from the audience, if that's okay, and pose them to the panel. So one of them, which would be really applicable to any kind of decarbonization process to our heritage buildings, is one about from Mike Costa, and I think it's in response to Rahul, what you were saying. He says, if we steel buildings more successfully, will condensation be an unwelcome side effect? And how do we deal with that? And I'm aware that this is a massive concern in terms of heritage buildings, especially, but some of the older stock that we have in the UK. Any thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, so in Germany, in order to, like I explained at the beginning, the subsidies that EcoWorks gets if a building is renovated to a certain standard. And in order to get this, the German government has like a committee that is actually checking buildings. And in order to do so, those buildings need to meet some standards. And in order to measure these standards, you go into a building and you actually blow air into the house and measure how much of this air is going basically through like the walls, the windows, etc., etc. In order to basically control that, you also have like ventilation stuff in the building, which is controlling these kind of errors. So I think there won't be this problem if you do it right. And EcoWorks has proven to have done it like multiple times in a correct way. So I think there is no problem with that.
Great. That's good to hear. There's another question from the audience, and they're asking, how might carbon trading influence better climate performance in the real estate sector? And of course, we've seen Article 6 of the Paris Agreement rulebook being ratified at COP26 this time. I don't believe that UK were really for it from the start. They were resisting it, and I think for the right reasons, that we should not be hanging our hat on offsets. We should be trying to address emissions in situ. But it would still be very interesting to hear your views on where carbon trading has a place in this whole decarbonization cycle, if you like. Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a strong view on that. You know, I think it definitely has a place. I think you know, there's a lot of actually great comments on the chat from Oliver Harwood, and I'd love to bring some of his points forward. You know, I think yes, the biggest outcome I think that came out of COP was Article 6. So for those that don't know, the architecture for carbon markets under the Paris Agreement, decisions on you know, trading carbon credits between nations and mechanisms to go beyond country by country trading, and that still hasn't all been ironed out yet. But you know, there is the kind of focus on getting there. The issue is that we tried this in 1997 with the CDM, which is the Clean Development Mechanism, where rich countries could reduce their emissions by paying for development of carbon reducing projects in developing countries, and they counted those reductions as part of their own targets. But then that completely collapsed because 85% of those offset projects used by the EU, for example, didn't reduce emissions at all. So there's this huge widespread corruption. It's taken until now for, you know, now we have all these other mechanisms to reduce corruption, like, you know, blockchain technology or effectively just distributed databases that can be used to avoid, you know, double counting of offsets and you know, kind of clear accountability of where, you know, where those offsets lie. So I definitely think there is a place for, you know, for carbon trading, and we've seen this already now, where, you know, where there's you know, there's high quality and low quality offsets, and where, you know, up until, you know, a few years ago, there's all this kind of question around greenwashing and buying low quality offsets, which is a lot of the kind of this reforestation efforts that then would get wiped away if, you know, if there were forest fires, or if, you know, they would get double counted. Now there's a big focus on high quality offsets, and I think that, you know, the only way for, you know, to deal with the demand supply imbalance that we have now in that sector is like a common carbon market. And that brings in this question around carbon taxes too, because it's kind of all accompanied. And I just want to kind of, you know, boost this comment that Oliver Harwood has made on the chat. Net Zero, a book by Dieter Helm, is a great book, and talks about how we can use carbon pricing to fix our problem at the moment.
Yeah, that's really a good insight, Rahul. The only issue,
if I can just add a quick thing on this.
Sure, absolutely, Tony, go for it.
Just a quick one. In one way, you could see carbon offset as being a mean to avoid doing something, but in the other hand, you can see that as putting a cost of doing nothing and putting a price of doing nothing. And so in the ROI calculation I was mentioning earlier, it plays a key role, I think, to help financial model to have new inputs, and so in that sense, I think it's really useful on top of what Raul already mentioned.
And absolutely, and there's, you know, the easy way is to regulate the utilization of carbon offsets anyway. It's not that difficult to do that, and make sure that they're used correctly. The issue, of course, is that you mentioned low quality and high quality offsets, and that's crucial to get right. Again, you know, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that. If done rightly, then of course there's a huge amount of advantages, a double advantage, in fact, you can have, because, for example, if you if you look at carbon offsets that are of the highest quality that are related to, for example, direct air carbon capture, then you have the whole opportunity to build an industry sector and an innovative industry sector around carbon emissions reductions using carbon offsets as a kind of an input. Which would be very, very interesting, and the UK could really work on that sort of thing. But there is the problem of low carbon, low quality offsets, where you don't have the permanence, and that is the big problem. So with real estate and the way real estate is developed and the gestation periods, so we're talking about life cycles of 60 years plus on any building, we need to have offsets that are actually equivalent in terms of quality and in terms of permanence. And I think that is a crucial difference, I think, as to how real estate needs to look at carbon offsets vis-a-vis another sector, like, for example, aviation. Interesting discussion. And I think that there's one question that perhaps I should have asked right at the start, which was, what is net zero and how do you calculate it? But I think what we would do is for that question, perhaps we can actually answer it a little bit later. I could, if I could invite one of the panelists to write something, or I'm happy to draft something up and send it to that attendee. It's absolutely right to ask about, what is net zero and how do we measure it? There's another question that's come up about biodiversity, which I think is really important in nature-based solutions. And what do we feel the role of carbon removal via nature-based solutions will be in future years? Perhaps that should be the last question. We probably have a couple of minutes. We have a couple of minutes left before I need to thank everyone. So if I can get a very quick answer on that from one of the panelists, that'd be great. Anyone to go? Nature-based solutions. Tongi, you're smiling. Would you like to take it?
Sorry, I think I will leave this one to Raul.
Okay. No, I will just give you a very, very broad answer. So for high quality carbon offsets to be effective in all solutions, whether that's built environment or nature-based, I think we think about, adoption in the industry. So right now, like, why have we not already had these solutions? Industry adoption is the biggest bottleneck. And if you can, and whether, we've seen this already happening in nature-based solutions too, as well as in construction. If you can create high quality carbon offsets by using the technology, then you turn a cost center into a profit center. Mm-hmm. And that drives industry adoption. So it's more important than just the fact that you can use offsets to offset your carbon emissions. It's actually driving adoption, which I think is the most important thing.
And driving new business models in new industry sectors, which is all really important. And I'd suggest to the attendee who's asked that question to look up regenerative agriculture. It's a very, very interesting sector. That would fall into that nature-based category. Great. I thank you. All I have time for now, it's already 10 o'clock. A very quick thank you to all of you for attending and for such a fascinating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. This is all our guests at Coles and our guests who have come in through Savills. Thank you very much, Savills, for sponsoring our ESG webinar series and keeping us on our toes. We try to introduce a new topic every 2 months. And we'd love to see you again at the next one, which is in January, which is looking at ESG from the residential perspective. So thank you all again and have a very good morning. Bye-bye.